This is Where We Live. I am David DeRoche in for Lucy Nalpathanchel. Every day we wake up and make decisions, what to wear, what to eat. In theory, we use bits of information to help us make good choices. But with big decisions, we ostensibly need even more information to make a smart choice, like who to vote for. So what happens when information is overwhelming, or when there's conflicting information, or when people can't even agree on which information is true and which is false? Today we're exploring some of these big questions. Coming up, we'll talk from a professor and expert in semantics who will talk about this new world we live in and the role that words and language play in governance. Later, we'll speak to a mathematician who says there's a crisis in critical thinking. And finally, we'll talk to a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist about his efforts to teach everyone to think like a journalist. But first, we'd like to know what you think. Are people living in different realities because of the information we choose to believe? And if so, what does that mean for democracy? You can join the conversation at 860-275-7266, email wherewelive@wnpr.org, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Joining us now from the studios of WFDU at Fairleigh Dickinson University in New Jersey is Lance Straight. He's a professor of communication and media studies at Fordham University and author of several books, including Amazing Ourselves to Death, Neil Postman's Brave New World Revisited. He's also president of the New York Society for General Semantics. Lance Straight, welcome to Where We Live.
Thank you very much. Great to be here.
As someone who has whose expertise is in words and their definitions, I should probably be fairly precise with my language and avoid any impromptu fact checks by our guest here. But speaking of fact checks, that's an entire industry now. It's actually been an industry for at least a decade. But it seems like these days we have facts, alternative facts, fake facts, and all these things in between. So first, let's lay out some context, or I guess we could say let's lay out some facts, some traditional facts. 2016 was certainly a transformative year in politics and international relations. We saw Great Britain vote to break away from the European Union, and after an unconventional campaign, we saw a reality TV star and billionaire businessman win the presidency here in the U.S. Of course, there's the ongoing propaganda battle between the U.S. and Russia, and in this context, Oxford Dictionaries named the word of the year in 2016 post-truth, which they define as relating to or denoting circumstances in which objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion than appeals to emotion and personal belief. So, certainly propaganda and manipulations have been around for a while, but post-truth sort of connotes something a bit different and perhaps more sinister. I don't know, what do you think of that term, and are we living in an era of post-truth?
Well, I've got some qualms about that term. It kind of reminds me, maybe a step up from Stephen Colbert's truthiness that he used to characterize George W. Bush. Really it comes down to we don't really have truth or believe in truth in quite the same way that people have historically, and not today in our contemporary world. People used to have general agreement about what the truth is, but we've come to understand that truth depends on the situation. So what's true, say, in mathematics or in logic is different from what's true for scientists, or what's true in a house of worship, or what's true in a courtroom. So post-truth, I think, is less apt than really post-rational. We're just not committed to that experiment in rationality that we called, that goes back to the Enlightenment, and it's kind of what the American Republic and the American experiment was based on.
So where do you think we took this turn toward less rational thinking? Where do you think that happened?
I think it definitely has to do with the electronic media, especially television, and then further amplified by the internet. Before we had these forms of communication, we pretty much relied on words, and there were words in print, and then we talked about the words in print, and our minds were shaped by our ability to read and write, and so we took statements. Really what we're talking about are statements, because when we were talking about facts, facts actually don't exist in the world. Of course, which is not to say that there aren't things in the world or events in the world, that go on, but facts are statements about them. And so when we can make a clear statement and then judge it to be true or false, then we can call that kind of statement a fact. So if I say it's raining outside right now, and of course we specify that we're talking about where you are or where I am because we're not in the same place. But when we make that specific description, we can then use our senses and determine whether that's accurate or not. So that there's a sense of truth that's easy to understand, and that's based on making clear, well-defined statements.
So that's interesting because I think most people will will hear the word fact and they'll assume that that's something that has been confirmed to be true. But what you're saying is that an actual fact is something that could be disproven or it could be false.
Absolutely, and the key is that it's open to being proven false. Those of us of a certain age may remember when Ronald Reagan was president and he became notorious for quoting false facts. And there were statements that people were able to go to and determine and point out that no, this is not true, or at least the evidence does not support the statement. I mean, often they came from motion pictures rather than from real life. And science, when we look at science, which really still is our best source of getting a sense of what's out there, what's in the world, science depends on this idea of facts being open to falsification. I know a statement like it's raining outside right now is something that we can say is true or false, but a more general statement like whenever dark clouds gather, it rains, that can only be falsified, because when you find just one instance where it isn't true, then the generalization is falsified. So science and science conducted properly always understand that never have absolute truth, but the key is that we're always open to testing and always open to falsification. And that's a far cry from where you hear like Sean Spicer and folks like that talk about the fact that the president believes this to be true. And so despite all evidence to the contrary, all falsifications, the president still believes this to be true, that his truth is based on belief, not evidence.
Speaking of motion pictures, I'd like to play a clip real quick from the Indiana Jones, the third one in the Indiana Jones trilogy, where he is he's an archaeologist and he's in class, and this is what he has to say about the subject.
Archaeology is the search for fact, not truth. If it's truth you're interested in, Dr. Tyree's philosophy class is right down the hall.
So, I mean, I know this is, sort of meant to be a cute little line in the movie, but it does raise sort of an interesting question. And I wonder and you've kind of touched on this already, but I wonder if you can flesh this out a bit. Is truth, is this really just a matter left to philosophy, or does that mean there's no such thing as an absolute truth? Is truth subjective all the time?
It's not subjective, but it depends on the kind of situation and the kind of discourse, if you like, the kind of language that we're using. So in mathematics, you can certainly say 1 + 1 = 2, but in the real world, that's not the case. That is, sometimes you have an object and you add another object and you get two objects, but say if you have a cloud and you add another cloud to it, you don't have two clouds, or you don't have a cloud that's twice as big. Something else is going on. So it's very easy to talk about truth in a deductive system. That is one where we begin with certain assumptions, and we can say, based on these assumptions, this is true or this is not true. So based on the Bible, if we assume if we start with the Bible, then based on the Bible, the world was created in 6 days, and God created the world. And it's true according to the Bible. But once we go beyond our first principles and say, well, let's look for evidence, that's where things start to get messy. I think a great example, I mean, something all Americans should be familiar with, are the lines, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." And in a way, that's a line of great chutzpah, because it's not self-evident, and not everyone believed in it. In fact, it was very much a statement against the British monarchy, who did not believe that all individuals are created equal. But where they said truths, I think we could better understand that they're talking about principles, that we begin with these principles. They're not questioned. They're not subject to any testing or proof. We start with these principles, and based on these principles, we then can arrive at the conclusion that people are entitled to govern themselves.
You know, as much as I love to dive into the constitutional arguments and the religion stuff, that probably is another talk show topic. But
politics and religion, eh?
Oh, right. But I want to come back to what you mentioned before with Sean Spicer and sort of representing beliefs of Donald Trump as being true, and also of course we have the alternative facts thing. But let's just say, for argument's sake, that when Kellyanne Conway had made that statement, that she actually had some kind of data or study to back those facts up. Because we do see this a lot. And in fact, actually in Connecticut, the legislature is considering a bill on legalizing marijuana, and advocates from each side have presented conflicting studies to the lawmakers. One says legalized pot in Colorado has led to more car accidents, but another says that legalized pot has had no effect on car accidents. So how are people supposed to know when they're getting these conflicting studies, they're getting conflicting information that actually are presenting facts that tell two completely different stories? How are people supposed to know what's true?
Well, and the thing is, they can both be true at the same time, because the world is messy and things are rarely absolutely one way or another. And it's a great point. I mean, studies give us information. In a sense, they give us data that we can use. They give us evidence to work with. But they don't tell us how to evaluate that evidence. They don't tell us how to arrive at a judgment. And that's really the problem. That's where I say, on the one hand, we have big data, and on the other hand, we have big data, in the sense of a loss of rationality on both sides, and this sort of irrational reaction to events. I think, again, Trump is a great example where there's no policy that we can discern, and instead he reacts to images that he sees on television, which is what we all do, because images don't give us clear evidence, they don't give us clear judgment of how to evaluate evidence. They just show us things, and it's the statements and the arguments that tell us what to do. So ultimately, judgment depends, again, on language and on the ability to engage in a rational discussion and argument in the sense of debate, not in the sense of just yelling at each other, which is what we often see. I think we go back to that old assumption: freedom of speech and freedom of the press gives us the free marketplace of ideas. And that used to mean that by exchanging different points of view and different bits of evidence and different opinions, we could arrive at some form of agreement and consensus about what to do based on our agreement and the consensus about what the truth is. So opinion used to be the basis of discussion. Today, opinion is the end of discussion. People say, well, that's your opinion and this is my opinion, and that's it. It's the end. There's nowhere to go with that. And that's a complete reversal from the way things used to be.
We're going to continue this conversation. Lance, you made a really interesting point about just how truth is messy. This is Where We Live. I'm David DeRoche, in for Lucy Nalpathanchel. We're talking about how we get our information in the digital age and how we can't always agree on the facts, truth, and reality. Joining me is Lance Straight. He's a professor of communication at Fordham. Do you worry about the abundance of information, verified or not, right at our fingertips? Are we in an age of promise or danger? Are people living in completely separate realities? Join the conversation, 860-275-7266. Email us at wherewelive@wnpr.org, and find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live. I'm David DeRoche in for Lucy Nalpathanchel. Today we're talking about how we get our information in the digital age and how we can't always agree on facts, truth, and reality. On phone today is Dan Rockmore. He's a professor of mathematics and computer science at Dartmouth College, and he's author of a Huffington Post op-ed entitled A Crisis for Critical Thinking. He's also editor and contributor of What Are the Arts and Sciences, a Guide for the Curious. Before we get to Dan, I'd like to tell us your thoughts. Are we living in a world where our realities are so different that democracy itself is threatened? Join the conversation at 860-275-7266. Email wherewelive@wnpr.org. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Also joining us from New Jersey is Lance Straight. He's a media studies professor at Fordham University. Dan, welcome to Where We Live.
Hi, Lance. Hi, David. Sorry.
Hey.
No worries. Thank you for joining us this morning. Before we get to Dan, I wanted to get to Jesse, who is calling in right now. Jesse has to leave, so I wanted to get his comment. Go ahead, Jesse. You're on Where We Live.
Hi, thank you very much for having me on. I'm heavily involved with fisheries, especially through New England Fishery Management Council, and I'm in the Recreational Advisory Panel. And oftentimes we have to vote on weird data, and even there's a program on last night about our cod situation where fishermen have way different numbers than some of our biologists, like from the Northeast Science Center. We're currently working on ways to get an app actually done so recreational angling can be better tracked. But the big thing is getting data vetted. If it's vetted by a more regional group, it still has to be vetted by NOAA, and then so on and so forth. And that's really, really hard to do, to prove that there's no data bias. And that's something that we're running into now, and it's something that we're constantly tackling. And the big thing at every single meeting is data collection. What are your thoughts on that? I mean, how can we get to something? Because, I mean, obviously, it's in our best interest to be good stewards of the populations of our fish, but also we're talking about keeping a culture alive, saving jobs, and a whole industry here in New England.
Jesse, thank you so much for your call. Lance, could you tackle that? What advice would you have for people who are struggling to vet this type of data?
Well, in a long tradition in science is that when there's conflicting data, you do more testing, and you compare and you look for the preponderance of data. So I think that's the beginning of it. But when you have 99 studies that show things are one way, and one or two studies that say no, you have to question those one or two studies, and that requires also educated evaluation of it. But then you have that data, and then the question is, what is the political judgment to be taken from that data? And we have to. That's always the difficult part to consider. But I mean, my God, we have to not deny what the data, what the evidence shows us. We have to start with that as the basis, and then apply some rational thought and some moral evaluation as well. That's something that we also lose. In all this disparity and different viewpoints is a commonly held set of ethical, moral principles to make our decisions from.
I want to turn now to Dan Rockmore. He's a mathematician at Dartmouth College. Dan, you wrote your op-ed in the Huffington Post. It was called A Crisis for Critical Thinking. Do you think we are at a moment when there is a critical thinking crisis? Because it seems like that's just how people are, how we've always been that way, that most of us just aren't inclined to critically examine a problem and explore the facts and seek supporting evidence. Is it human nature to not think critically? What are your thoughts on that?
So maybe I'll try to contextualize it with respect to the question from the listener. So data comes at you, and just because it's quote unquote data and it has some scientific imprimatur on it, it doesn't actually mean it's been gathered in an appropriate way, or even when the data is presented to you, that you've dug deeply enough to understand how the data was gathered, which is what you need in order to evaluate it. So the kind of 30,000-foot take on it is that you do need to think and reflect on anything, on any opinion, on any collection of numbers that are presented to you. And to the extent that we've managed to make that a standard thing for people to do, to reflect on information as it's received, I think we are at a difficult place in history. That doesn't seem to be what we do, and I don't know that the environments in which many of us are working foster that kind of reflection.
And that's an interesting point because there are a lot of distractions, and it seems like we're in a time in history when there are so many things that are vying for our attention. So, what do you think people can do to to address this? Like, how can people combat sort of the distractions that are really pervasive in society, and be inspired to take the time to try to critically examine and explore the things that we're reading online or exposed to in the media?
Well, I mean, look, the truth is that we live in a very fast-paced world now. People are working more than ever, in fact, just to get by, and there isn't a lot of time for reflection. I mean, all jobs seem to now have a kind of 24/7 nature to them, as so many people have to carry devices to be on call all the time. So it's not really something that's fostered, and to be honest, it's a kind of privileged position to say that you should sit down quietly for an hour every day and read or something like that. So I think a lot of people would like to do that, and I generally come back to how we're educating our kids. It's not that the adults are a lost generation, but we can always try to do better with respect to the generations that we're bringing up. So I do think in the schools we can do things to have children reflect more. I do think there's a kind of pernicious assault of digital technologies at the younger ages. To the extent that we could mitigate that a bit, I think would go away. Would go a long way. But generally, it seems difficult. But generally, if we could get to a place where people would take a moment before reacting, that would probably serve us in democracy quite a bit.
So, Dan, just so people are clear, maybe you could just lay out some definitions of critical thinking. I think you've kind of touched on it with the mention of reflection, taking the time to reflect before you react. But is there more to critical thinking than just that? Can you maybe just lay it out for us? How would you describe critical thinking?
So critical doesn't mean criticizing, and so critical thinking is this reflection on the information that's come your way, trying to consider it from multiple points of view, trying to think carefully about if it's words that you're considering, who's saying them, where they're being said, what the context is in which they're being said, and maybe what the goal of having those words brought to you is. If it's visual information, how the image is set up, again, what the context is how is it being presented to you? Are you seeing it in a museum, in a storefront, on a television, on a handheld device? Because I can promise you that the people who are sending you those images or sending you those words have often thought very carefully about how those words, images, media generally are being directed at you in order to tweak certain emotional buttons in you. So in some sense, it's giving the same serious thought to the media that you're receiving as the folks who provided it for you are doing.
That's an interesting point. This is Where We Live. I'm David DeRoche. I'm in for Lucy Nalpathanchel. Today we're talking about how we consume information in the digital age. I'm talking with Dan Rockmore. He's a math professor at Dartmouth College. And also joining me is Lance Straight. He's a professor in media studies at Fordham. Tell us what you think. Has the internet and social media shaped your perception of reality? If so, for the better or for the worse? I want to take a call now. Greg is calling us from on the road. Greg, go ahead. You're on Where We Live.
Hi. Thank you so much for having me on.
Absolutely. What's your question or comment?
I've been interested in fact versus truth as I work in the medical profession, and I often see patients strictly looking, say, if they're looking at blood work, for instance, as you're discussing with them, they're looking for a specific number. And I'm often wondering about context versus when somebody's trying to understand something. To me, if the fact is simply, okay, you're looking for a specific value, there's a certain set of parameters that are applied to the value. But if you're looking how to integrate that knowledge into a whole picture, there's a much deeper meaning and there's a piece of flexibility with it. So my question is, when presented with this, one, it's a deeper question of how to change person's thinking, but the other piece is, how much does context play a role in somebody's understanding, seeking truth versus fact?
It's a great question, Greg. I mean, I think the callers and my guests would agree that context plays a huge role. But Dan, I wonder if you could expand on that. What do you think about just the question there about context and just overall the deeper meaning of these things?
Well, when it comes to medical data, that's a very it's a complicated question. I mean, I'm sure that Greg, if he's providing this information for a patient or someone else, I mean, is fully aware that numbers come in a distribution. A patient receives a test value, and that's somewhere in a whole collection of test values, and then that test value is over a very large population, and where that particular patient sits in the population may actually, does mean a lot with respect to what that number means to him or her. So, so there are multiple contexts here. There's the context of the number in a broad population. There's the context of the number in the small population that includes the genetic and environmental context of this patient. And then there's even the context of receiving this information in a doctor's office. You know, how nervous that might make the patient. So, I mean, I think it does shine a bright light on, again, understanding. So first of all, realizing that there's something to understand about where your information comes from. It's not just a number. It comes with all this data baggage, if you like, and also that the person receiving it comes with a particular context. And then the question of truth is the question of, in this case, is the question of, well, how is this patient, how is the doctor going to act given that information? So the kind of actionable underlying information in the kind of superficial piece of information.
Yeah, and it does seem like the trend these days is to rely on numbers, and people tend to think of numbers as this absolute truth. But to your point, if they're taken out of context, they can be made to mean anything. Lance, could you jump in here? What are your thoughts on this issue of context and its role in understanding what's true and what's real?
I think it's really the key term, and I'm so glad that it's been introduced, because without context, we have no way of evaluating anything. And a part of the problem with numbers is that they don't really have a context in and of themselves, and it's up to us to provide that context. And then what we see is that the more that we add our technologies of communication, the more that we take things out of context, so that when we're having a conversation in the same place at the same time, we have a very clear and obvious context. When you take those words and write them down, they're taken out of context. And in fact, that Plato has Socrates complaining about that in his treatise, The Phaedrus. I mean, so this goes back to antiquity, but how much more so in television and the internet and social media. One of the key terms that or phrases that comes up now is context collapse, that all these electronic media completely eradicate our different contexts and merge them together in a way that makes it really very difficult to make sense out of things. And to get back to I think the point about reflection is so key as well. And you look at what's happening, we get, the problem is information. We have too much information. It comes at us too quickly. It turns over too too quickly. And with all that information, everything becomes so specialized so that you can only really understand a tiny bit of what's coming down the pike. And we have to rely on experts to tell us what to think, because we really can't evaluate. Nobody really knows what the economy, what's best for the economy, not even the economists, if they were honest about it. And nobody knows whether bombing Syria or dropping that bomb on Afghanistan was a good thing to do, or whether the Iran deal with Obama was the right thing to do or not. It's simply just all these unknowns, and so we're left with this sense of helplessness, and yes, no time for reflection in all of this deluge, because ultimately information is not knowledge. Knowledge requires context, and knowledge is not wisdom, and that requires a human context. Without that, we're lost.
You make a really good point. I imagine that we almost live in almost a knowledge fallacy, where we feel like because there's so much information, we can know whatever we want, and so then that makes us. It's easier for us to create opinions when we don't have all the facts, because we feel like there's so much information out there. I want to switch gears and maybe go to a caller. Robert is calling from New Haven. Robert, go ahead. You're on Where We Live.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thanks for your call. What's your comment or question?
So I come from a background of math and physics, and I produce a video series in which I teach athletes how to best use body mechanics and physics in general in order to achieve basically bigger jumps and move faster through their environment. It's a parkour series, and in that I was very surprised to find out that though the majority of athletes take the information and really work with it and like it, I still get a lot who will take that information and just immediately turn around and argue that, no, you can't tell me what will work for me. Your physics doesn't work in my case. I've had athletes who will stand there for 2 hours with me and try to prove wrong a physics equation, which is just proven physics, and never succeed and ignore my advice. So I deal on a very regular basis with people who just refuse to listen to science almost as a principle. And it's probably one of the things that frustrates me most about my job. So
I can imagine.
Yeah, it's something I experience a lot.
Robert, thank you so much for your point. Dan, as a mathematician, is this something you think you could weigh in on? Any advice for Robert and how you could either get people interested in appreciating what science brings to the table?
I guess the broader point is the way in which people receive something that they've been told up front is science, or that they, which can be numbers, or a physics equation, or being told is physics. For some people, that opens a door, and for some people, it shuts it and puts a lock on it. But I think these days, when people are receiving data, or receiving this kind of information, they'll either surrender to it, even if they don't understand it, because they figure, well, it comes with a scientific label, so it must be true, or they'll fight it because they don't understand it. So generally, when you're trying to bring science to someone who isn't a priori receptive to it, you have to lead them in slowly, and you have to lead them in a friendly way. I'm sure that Robert tries to do this, and I can tell you from the other side of the lectern that you get a whole spectrum of modes of reception to these things. So it's patience and persistence and a smile.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Can get you pretty far.
Yeah, that could be said for a lot of things in life. We do have to go to a break in a minute, but before we go, I wanted to play a clip from CBS Evening News anchor Scott Pelley, who got the Walter Cronkite Award last year at Arizona State University, and here's what he had to say.
Think of this. Is terrorism the greatest threat to our country? Or a recession? I suggest to you today that the quickest, most direct way to ruin a democracy is to poison the information.
Lance, we do have to go to break, but your quick thoughts and your reaction to what Pellet was saying?
Well, I'm completely in agreement with it. Democracy is based on access to information. The old way of thinking was that you people can't govern yourselves. It's like the king in the Hamilton musical. You can't govern yourselves because you don't know enough to govern yourselves. And it was only after the invention of the printing press, making information, making knowledge easily accessible to large numbers of people, that we could turn around and say, we do know enough. We can make decisions.
Dan, what are your thoughts, quickly?
Absolutely. In a democracy, people are voting. They're voting on their feelings, on what they think is true, and if they're being fed falsehoods, then they'll be voting on things that aren't true.
Lance Straight is professor of communication and media studies at Fordham. Dan Rockmore is a math professor at Dartmouth. Both will stick around. When we come back, we'll talk with a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist about his effort to make news literacy a common part of the curriculum for high school. This is Where We Live. I'm David DeRoche, in for Lucy Nalpathanchel. Coming up on Monday, 2017 marks 50 years since a U.S. Supreme Court decision put an end to laws banning interracial marriage. On the next Where We Live, we revisit our conversation about the civil rights case, Loving versus Virginia. Have society's perceptions really changed? We ask interracial couples living in Connecticut that question and more. We know many of you tune in to Where We Live on your car radio or stream us live at WNPR.org. But you can't listen live mornings at 9 or evenings at 7. You can subscribe to Where We Live on iTunes, Stitcher, TuneIn, or any podcast app. Today, we're talking about how we consume information in the digital age. I've been talking with Dan Rockmore. He's a math professor at Dartmouth, and Lance Straight. He's a media studies professor at Fordham. We want to focus on now media literacy, news literacy in the digital age. And what is news literacy? Why is it important, and how can we teach it? Joining us now to talk about this is Alan Miller. He's president and CEO of the News Literacy Project, and he also earned a Pulitzer Prize while working as a journalist with the LA Times. Alan, welcome to Where We Live.
Good morning, David. It's a pleasure to join you.
Well, thank you so much for being here. Now, as a journalist, as an award-winning journalist and longtime reporter for the LA Times, just tell us a little bit about what news literacy is and what prompted you to start the News Literacy Project.
Sure. We define news literacy as the critical thinking skill and how to know what to believe in a digital age, how to determine what is verified and credible information versus raw information, opinion, advertising, and misinformation as both a consumer and a creator. We really feel this is a survival skill in an information age that we are teaching literacy for the 21st century. What prompted me to start it was back in 2006 when I was doing investigative reporting in the Washington Bureau of the Los Angeles Times. I was invited to my daughter's middle school to talk about what I did as a journalist and why it mattered. And when I left, I thought this is a long way from investigative reporting. If a lot of journalists brought their expertise and experience to bear, it could be extremely meaningful. And I had two concerns at the time. One was what the wrenching transition that was happening in the news business and whether there would continue to be an appreciation and a demand for the kind of quality journalism to which I had dedicated my career, and also how my own 12-year-old daughter was accessing and evaluating this tsunami of information of such varying credibility, accountability, and transparency.
So, I mean, you touched on why you think this is important, but for journalists also, do you feel like most people don't even trust journalists? Do you feel like that you have to prove your worth? Is that the case with students?
Well, I would take that sort of two sides of that coin. For one, I think everybody needs to think like a journalist in an information age because everybody is their own editor and everybody can be their own publisher. So how do people do this in a way that is credible and responsible and empowers their voices? Obviously, there is an enormous problem now with the lack of trust in journalism, and there's a whole series of reasons we could get into why that is. But I think it's very important that people understand that all information is not created equal, and that journalism, while imperfect by its very nature, and we underscore that for a lot of reasons, still has certain standards that it aspires to, and these are the aspirational standards that we teach young people to use in assessing any information that they encounter. And there's a certain level of accountability and transparency that you have with journalism versus a lot of other information that is out there. And as we now know, a tremendous amount of misinformation and even disinformation driven by profit motive and ideological reasons where people simply make things up, what has been called fake news, what I like to think of hoaxes, viral rumors, and conspiracy theories. So while journalism may be imperfect, I think that, again, it's an aspiration to inform. There's a certain level of standards and accountability, and I think people have to be mindful of that when choosing their sources of news and information and asking themselves what it is that they are looking at, consuming, believing, sharing, and acting on.
I'm glad you sort of clarified your fake news, because I do feel like that's more of a political hammer than anything else these days. Because I mean, obviously, fabrications have been around for a long time. There was, Jason Blair at the New York Times, Stephen Glass, Janet Cook, even Brian Williams with the gunshots, taking gunfire. So fabrications have been a part of mainstream media. It's not just alternative media. Before we continue this conversation, I do want to turn to a caller. Stephen is calling from New Britain. Go ahead, Stephen. You're on Where We Live.
How you doing? Well, I know you guys have been talking a lot about fake news and things like that and misinformation and how people accept that misinformation or just true information. And even with the science, how people accept scientific fact versus, other things. But I feel like that subconsciously people will gravitate towards whatever news will quell their fear or justify their fear. In an example of something like creationism, where you have science involved, or you have a science that's telling you about evolution and dinosaur bones and things of that nature, where people, whether or not they believe it's true or not, will gravitate towards fake news or misinformation because deep down, subconsciously, it justifies what they believe in, or it may quell a fear. And what kind of scares me is that people in that situation will kind of sway in the direction of that, like in the elections, that may have swayed votes in certain respects because people felt more comfortable with the misinformation. Even though maybe deep down they knew it was misinformation, it made them feel a little more comfortable in hearing that.
Stephen, thank you so much for your point. I think this confirmation bias that definitely a lot of us kind of deal with, we seek out things that to reaffirm our biases, is definitely something that plagues us. But then it's also the point of what incentive would somebody have to seek out information that they disagree with? Alan, do you take this one?
Sure. Stephen's absolutely right. He raises an extremely important point. When people see the news through prisms of red and blue, they tend to see the world in terms of black and white. And I think increasingly there's the opportunity now for people to find, only go to those sources that they know they're going to agree with and to reinforce their pre-existing beliefs. And that is also reinforced by the algorithms, so that based on what they're looking at, that's what they're going to be given, whether they're aware of that or not. And I think it makes people very prone to being manipulated and misled. And, one of the things that we teach is, first of all, to be aware of your own confirmation bias and to look for wider sources of news and information to challenge your pre-existing belief. But this is a big and growing problem that has both, added to the hyperpartisanship and I think made it very difficult for us as a country and communities to agree on even a set of facts before we debate what may be the solutions to existing problems. And I think that the key to this is education and self-awareness for consumers.
And certainly this has been a problem for a long time, and I think you can reasonably say that in life, people tend to hang out with people that they agree with. So we don't necessarily seek out people to hang out with that we disagree with. I mean, some of us probably do, but most people probably don't. I got another caller, Kevin from Glastonbury, is calling. Kevin, go ahead. You're on Where We Live.
Hey, good morning.
Good morning. What's your comment or question?
Well, I have to comment on something I heard on WNPR a couple of weeks ago. Some guy called in, said he got his news from YouTube. And I was dumbfounded that somebody could think that YouTube was a source of news.
Dan, Alan, what do you think about that? YouTube as a source of news?
Well, I mean, people get their news from all kinds of sites. They can set up an entire news feed for themselves. You can't force people to go to other places. I have often thought that, given that everybody's on a digital platform these days, that if the big digital providers were concerned about this, they could actually attach a widget where, based on search histories and things like that, they could send you the feeds of the anti-you. I mean, they sort of know what the anti-you is in terms of your habits, and they could present the opportunity for people to seek out alternative positions instead of continually amplifying the position that they hold in order to figure out better ways to sell them stuff. So, people, I mean, look, it's democracy. It's not Syria. There's not one channel, and we should be thankful for that. On the other hand, I do think we could do a better job of being guardians of democracy by giving people broader pieces of information, true or false, but with some annotation to give a sense of what your neighbors are thinking.
Alan, just give us a sense. We only have a few minutes left in the show, but I want to get a sense of how you teach news literacy. What does your curriculum look like, and is this something that parents can probably do for their children?
So we started with classroom and after-school programs, which we're still running in New York and D.C. and Chicago. But we now have a virtual classroom, the Checkology virtual classroom, which people can access. It's an online platform, and we basically, it's 12 lessons that, among other things, teach students how to understand the difference between news, opinion, advertising, and the kind of raw information that people get on YouTube. Gives them an appreciation of the First Amendment, the watchdog role of the press in a democracy. We have lessons on bias, on the role of algorithms. And really, it's giving students the tools to inculcate the habit of mind to be skeptical and informed consumers, and ultimately informed and engaged citizens in a democracy. And it's being used now in all 50 states. We've got over 5,700 educators who teach over 800,000 students in every state in the country, including a large number in Connecticut, I might add, and 46 countries around the world who are registered to use the platform since we launched it in May. So there's a great demand. There's a tremendous interest, which is encouraging. Because clearly this is something that's needed very much by the next generation, I think, as well as all citizens.
Certainly. I want to get to Lance and Dan. We only have a few minutes, but Lance, in 30 seconds, just tell us your thoughts on the role of journalists play in the world we're living in today, to analyze or just give facts?
Well, I think we have to understand that when we're talking about the First Amendment and freedom of the press, there was no journalism as we understand it at that time, I want to say I'm all for this effort for news literacy, but we also need to understand that journalism as a professional activity is fairly recent. I mean, it coalesces during the late 19th century. And at that time, when we have newspapers, there are multiple. It's hard to imagine today that there were once multiple newspapers in every town, in every city. That New York had dozens of newspapers, and
Lance, I'm sorry. We're running out of time. Sorry, I have to thank our producers, Lydia Brown and Jeff Tyson, technical producers Kyone Wolf, WNPR's executive producer is Katie Tolarski. Thank you to our guests, Lance Straight, Dan Rockmore, and Alan Miller. This is Where We Live.